Okay, let's unpack this. Get ready, because we're diving into a statement that might genuinely surprise you.
Oh, yeah.
Christianity is spreading faster now than it has at any time in human history.
It really does sound counterintuitive, doesn't it? Especially if you're, looking at parts of the world where it seems to be shrinking.
Exactly.
But the information we're drawing from today, specifically from a piece called 50 Thrilling and Disturbing Years, it lays out some pretty compelling evidence for that exact claim.
Absolutely. So our mission in this deep dive is to take this source material and really try to understand this phenomenon. We're going to explore this idea of kingdom movements, figure out where this explosive growth is actually happening, and, spoiler, the big shift is overwhelmingly towards the global south.
Right.
And then look at what insights this holds, particularly when you contrast it with what's going on in the global north.
It's a huge global reshaping of the religious landscape, really. And the material suggests it's something many people just aren't aware of. So yeah, let's explore what these documents reveal.
All right, let's start with that core concept the text introduces, kingdom movements. The source mentions terms like disciple-making movements, church planting movements, T4T, four fields. What kind of thing are we actually talking about here?
Well, at its heart, these movements, whatever, specific name they go by, they seem to represent a really profound shift in how the church is expanding.
A shift.
How so? The source describes it as kind of a new concept that's emerged really powerfully over the last 50 years or so. It's especially picked up speed since the turn of the century.
Okay.
And the fundamental difference is captured in this phrase, multiplication, not just addition.
Multiplication, not addition. Okay, that sounds critical. What does that actually look like? How's it different from, say, traditional church growth?
Well, instead of churches just getting bigger by adding new members one by one.
Right, the traditional model.
Yeah. The focus here is on training ordinary believers very rapidly, giving them simple, reproducible tools.
Simple tools.
Yeah, simple enough that they can immediately go and start new groups or churches with others. And then those new groups repeat the process. It creates this kind of chain reaction.
Ah. Yeah.
Think of it less like, building one massive building, and more like scattering seeds where each one grows into a new plant, which then makes more seeds.
Gotcha. A viral spread, almost.
Kinda, yeah. The source says this approach is generating movements with such force across scores of countries, in such difficult places, and in such large numbers.
And where are these movements having the biggest impact, according to the source?
The documents are really clear on this. It's primarily happening in historically non-Christian regions.
So not Europe or North America predominantly?
No. Areas that have been mainly Hindu, Islamic, Buddhist, animistic. The text argues they're already altering the spiritual landscape in really significant ways in these places.
Which, as the source points out, stands in pretty stark contrast to the situation in the global north.
Exactly. It highlights that for many in the global north, these movements are still largely unknown, often happening while there's increasing spiritual discouragement or even decline over here.
Right.
Meanwhile, what's described in the global south is seeing the kingdom coming in ways the text suggests, even ancient figures only dreamed about.
That's a powerful way to frame it. And the material positions these movements as, applying Jesus' first-century answers to 21st-century problems.
Yeah, that's the idea. Animated by his specific instructions for advancing the kingdom, found in the Gospels.
So, a conscious effort to go back to basics.
Yes, it's presented as a very deliberate effort to return to the basic, reproducible methods Jesus used with his first disciples and apply them rigorously today.
Okay, well, to bring this down to earth a bit, the source gives a concrete example from Africa. It tells the story of a man named Hassan and an organization called Mission for All in one particular country there.
Yes, and this is a really key illustration, I think, of how these principles play out on the ground.
So what happened?
Well, Hassan apparently encountered the ideas behind these disciple-making movements, or DMMs, during a trip to the U.S. back in 2001.
Okay.
And what really hit him was this emphasis on training and empowering local indigenous leaders.
Not bringing in outsiders, but equipping the people already there.
Exactly. Equipping them to start reproducing churches right within their own communities, their own cultures.
So he took that idea back home with him.
He did. He started introducing the concepts, slowly at first. Then in 2005, Mission for All took a big step. They invited David Watson to come and train about 50 key Christian leaders from 6 different African countries.
Wow, 6 countries represented.
Yeah, and that event is kind of seen as the official launch of their DMM initiative in that region.
Was there something like a foundational element underpinning the whole effort from the very start?
Absolutely critical, according to this account, prayer.
Prayer.
Yes. The source really emphasizes that while the ministry had always valued prayer, this specific DMM initiative was, and this is their word, bathed in intercessory prayer from day one.
Bathed in prayer. What did that look like?
They intentionally recruited and trained intercessors, first scores, then hundreds, eventually thousands.
Thousands.
Thousands, yeah. Providing constant kind of behind-the-scenes support for every step of the process.
Wow. Thousands just dedicated to prayer for this. So what kind of results did they see in that specific country?
The numbers reported are, well, quite dramatic. The text states that in just 13 years, the number of churches in that country grew from around 50 to many thousands.
From 50 to thousands in 13 years.
Many thousands. Their stated goal now is actually to see a church started in every single village or urban neighborhood.
That's incredibly ambitious.
And they're apparently making significant progress. The average church size is about 54 members.
That's just staggering growth. And was it just in that one nation?
No, it's spread. This particular movement also successfully planted over 2,200 new churches, specifically among previously unreached people groups.
Unreached groups specifically.
Yes, across 8 other African countries. And this resulted in over 400,000 people becoming Christ followers, with the vast majority coming from those unreached backgrounds.
Incredible numbers. But beyond the sheer quantity, the source also talks of the qualitative transformation, especially in Muslim communities.
Yes, it shares a really powerful story about Mission for All reaching out to a Muslim community that had historically been very resistant.
Resistant how?
Well, resistant to the point where previous evangelists had actually been martyred there.
Wow, okay, high risk.
Very high risk. But they identified that the community's most pressing felt need was actually a school.
A school? That seems practical, maybe not overtly religious.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that was key. The source explains that Hassan approached the Muslim leaders. He offered to provide a qualified teacher who happened to also be a trained church planter.
Oh, okay.
If the community would gather the resources to build the school itself.
So a partnership based on a practical need.
Exactly. And this act of service, this, tangible goodwill, it built trust. It created an unexpected opening.
An opening for what?
For the Christian teacher to gradually begin sharing stories about God, eventually introducing Jesus, but in a really non-threatening way.
And what was the response in that resistant community?
Well, in just 2 years, 7 churches were planted within that community.
7 churches where people had been killed for trying before.
Yes. But the source stresses the deeper impact was the visible transformation in people's lives and the community itself.
Like what?
As these new believers started, living out what they found in the Bible, the whole community began to change. Things like men abusing their wives or children became far less common.
Really?
Yeah. Ancient clan hostilities started giving way to reconciliation, cooperation. Families that had been very inward-focused became generous.
So the change wasn't just personal belief, it was societal. And obvious.
Completely obvious, according to the account. It emphasizes this transformation was so apparent to neighboring communities that, despite the very real risks of persecution, in just a few years, 35 separate Muslim communities actually initiated contact with Mission for All.
They reached out.
They reached out. They specifically asked them to send the storytellers who had brought about this kind of change in the nearby towns.
Wow. That says so much about the impact of service and lived out faith.
It really does.
But with that level of success, especially among Muslims, surely there must have been opposition.
Oh, inevitably. Significant opposition. The source notes that as thousands of Muslims began following Christ, the established Muslim clerics in the region became, deeply alarmed.
Understandable from their perspective, I suppose.
Right. So they banded together, demanding that Mission for All shut down its operations entirely and that Hassan himself be deported.
Deported, wow. How did they navigate that kind of challenge?
Well, the conflict escalated right up to the highest level in the region, the office of the Muslim governor.
The governor, okay.
The governor called a meeting. He wanted to hear both sides, find some kind of resolution. And this created an incredible opportunity for Hassan.
What did he say? In front of the governor and the clerics who wanted him gone.
He spoke very openly about the work God was doing, but crucially, he didn't just talk about conversions.
What did he focus on?
He detailed the wide range of practical ways Mission for All and other Christians had served the communities explicitly for the purpose of helping their Muslim neighbors.
Like the school.
Like the school, yeah. But also mobile medical clinics, barefoot dentists, clean water projects, seed banks for farmers, sports programs for youth, all sorts of things.
And the clerics who were demanding his deportation were right there in the room.
They were right there. And the text notes that, somewhat begrudgingly at first, all gradually acknowledged that Hassan was speaking the truth about the service being provided.
They couldn't deny the good being done.
Apparently not. So after a moment of silence, the governor delivered his conclusion, and it was, well, unexpected.
What did he say?
He said, and this is a powerful quote from the source, "It would appear, if Muslims were doing as many good things for our own people as these Christians are doing, we would not have the problem of Muslims becoming Christians."
Whoa.
And then he added, "My recommendation is that we Muslims learn how to be better servants from these Christians."
Wow. That completely flips the script.
Mm.
He didn't just defend them. He told his own people to learn from them.
It certainly did. A total reversal.
Hmm.
The account states that many of the clerics who had come to that meeting determined to see Hassan deported actually ended up seeking his business card or trying to schedule further conversations with him afterwards.
Incredible. It really highlights how that blend of, spiritual truth and tangible service could disarm opposition.
And create new opportunities, yeah.
And this wasn't just an isolated success story in one country, right?
Mm-hmm.
The source says this model is now spreading globally from that nation.
That's right. This relatively small country is now sending its own DMM missionaries around the world, and apparently with high success rates.
So the model is transportable.
The material claims the model works almost everywhere in the country and across the continent where it's been applied, leading to dramatic transformation.
Mm-hmm.
The account ties it back to Jesus's parables, suggesting this nation is literally witnessing the kingdom grow like a mustard seed, or seeing the value of that pearl of great price, or seeing ordinary people invited to the great banquet.
Stories like that really give a tangible sense of these movements. But let's zoom back out now to the global picture and those really surprising statistics we started with.
Right. The claim that Christianity is spreading faster now than ever before.
Yeah. Does the data back that up?
The data compiled in the source absolutely supports it. And as we noted, this growth is concentrated almost entirely in the global south.
Okay, let's put some numbers on that, maybe starting with Africa.
Sure. The figures for Africa are pretty stark. In 1900, there were roughly 9 million Christians on the continent.
Okay, 9 million.
By the year 2000, that number had exploded to 335 million.
9 million to 335 million in one century.
Yep. That's a 37-fold increase. And the source points out the most dramatic acceleration happened after the 1960s.
Wow, a 3,700% increase, mostly in the last few decades of that century. What about Latin America?
Latin America saw a similar, maybe even more rapid, proportional rise among Protestants.
Okay.
From only about 50,000 in 1900, the number grew to over 64 million by today.
50,000 to 64 million?
Yeah. That's an incredible 1,280 times as many. And again, the bulk of that growth happened since the 1960s. The source notes a large majority identify as charismatic or Pentecostal evangelical.
Okay. And Asia, the most populous continent.
Asia's Christian population also saw significant growth. It increased from about 101 million in 1970 to 351 million in 2010.
So more than tripling in 40 years there. And China often comes up with surprising numbers. What does the source say?
Yeah, the source includes some pretty remarkable estimates for China. It suggests something like 10,000 new conversions might be happening every single day.
10,000 a day.
That's the estimate cited. Even conservative figures show a staggering 4,300% growth in the Christian population there over just 50 years.
Just incredible.
And the projection cited in the material is that by 2030, China could actually become the nation with the largest Christian population in the world.
China. Wow. These numbers are almost hard to comprehend, especially when you often hear narratives of decline. How does this compare to the traditional centers of Christianity?
Well, here's where that shift becomes incredibly clear. According to the source, there are now 3.7 times as many Protestants in Africa as there are in North America.
3.7 times as many in Africa than North America.
Yes. And the text emphasizes this gap isn't static. It's growing rapidly every single year. This isn't some slow, centuries-long shift. It's happened mainly in the last few decades.
And it's not just about where Christians are.
Yeah.
It's impacting the global flow of missions work, too.
Absolutely. Consider this data point from the source. In 1980, about 65% of the world's international missionaries were sent out from the global north.
Okay, the majority from the West.
Right. By 2020, that statistic had almost perfectly reversed. 63% were being sent from the global south.
Wow, a complete flip in 40 years.
Yes,
The source calls this a definitive shift.
it does.
What does that practically mean, though, when the majority of missionaries are coming from, say, Africa or Asia or Latin America rather than Europe or North America?
Well, it's a complete paradigm shift, really. These missionaries often face fewer cultural barriers in the places they go, which are often also in the global south. They understand the local dynamics more intimately,
Right.
and they're frequently more prepared for hardship and sacrifice because they might already be living in similar conditions. This cultural proximity, this lived experience, the source highlights them as key factors in their effectiveness.
Makes sense. And looking specifically at the data on these kingdom movements themselves.
The numbers here are perhaps the most striking evidence of where this growth is really accelerating. Take movements among Muslim populations. The source notes there were basically no documented movements like this until the 19th century. Only 2 recorded then just 1 in the 1960s, then 11 between 1980 and 2000.
Okay, so a slow buildup.
Very slow. But get this, between 2000 and 2017 alone, so just 17 years, the source states there were over 100 new movements discovered among Muslims.
Over 100 new movements in just 17 years. Among Muslims, that's exponential.
It certainly indicates that. The text reports that researchers are currently tracking something like 651 total kingdom movements globally.
651 movements.
And here's the critical point again. Only 8 of those 651 are located in North America, Western Europe, or Oceania.
Only 8 out of over 650. In the traditional centers of Christian activity.
Correct. The source's conclusion is pretty unambiguous. The kingdom of God has been unleashed and is advancing forcefully throughout the global south. It states clearly that the center of gravity of global Christianity has shifted definitively to the global south.
Okay, so we have this clear picture. Massive, accelerating growth driven by these movements, primarily in the global south. Which naturally leads to the question, how did this happen? What's the history here? And what are the strategies enabling this kind of expansion?
Well, the material is quick to acknowledge that foundational work by missionaries from the global north, back in the mid-20th century and earlier, was absolutely indispensable.
On the groundwork.
Exactly. Efforts like the increase in missionary activity after World War II. The source mentions examples like Jim Elliot and his team in 1956 helped sow seeds and establish initial communities in places where this rapid growth is now happening. It wasn't starting from absolute zero everywhere.
So the groundwork was laid. What other factors from that era contributed?
Well, alongside the on-the-ground work, some new missiological thinking started to emerge. The source highlights figures like Donald McGavran and Ralph Winter.
McGavran. What were some of his key ideas?
McGavran is credited with a couple of really important shifts in perspective, according to the text. First, this idea that the goal of missions wasn't to, transform a society into a Western image.
Right, not cultural imperialism.
No. But rather to bring people to Christ within the context of their own culture. He argued that growth is often fastest where there's cultural proximity between the messenger and the recipient. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, it does.
And second, he emphasized finding what he called bridges of God, basically. People within the target culture who could provide access and open doors into their communities. He talked about finding persons of peace, individuals God had already prepared.
Okay, finding insiders.
Yeah.
And how did Ralph Winter build on that?
Winter significantly shifted the focus. Instead of just thinking about reaching nations defined by political borders, he pushed for focusing on reaching people groups.
People groups.
Yeah, especially those considered unreached ethno-linguistically. Groups with their own language and culture who had little or no access to the gospel message. This allowed for much more focused strategic efforts.
Okay, so you have this foundation of earlier work, plus these new strategic ideas emerging from the global north. How did that lead to the rise of Global South missions and these movements we're talking about?
Well, as the church in the Global South grew rapidly, partly on the back of this earlier work, it reached a point, maybe around the 1980s, where they began sending out their own missionaries.
Ah, The reversal we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Initially, many went to other regions within the Global South, neighboring countries, unreached groups nearby, though some also started working among expatriate communities from their home countries living in the Global North.
And then the source points to a specific strategic breakthrough, something newer.
Yes, it describes what it calls a radical new strategy that really began to take shape about 25 years ago. It mentions it was particularly pioneered by some Southern Baptist missionaries in Asia, often in places where traditional methods hadn't seen much fruit.
What made it radical? What was different?
The core radical element, according to the source, was this decision to go back to and rigorously apply Jesus' own ministry model.
Jesus' model.
Yeah, as described in passages like Luke 10 and Matthew 10, where he sent out his disciples. They made a conscious choice to take Jesus' instructions very literally.
Literally, yeah.
Including his comments about disciple makers facing hardship, making significant sacrifices. They decided to essentially trust that Jesus' approach wasn't just for the first century, but was actually the most effective model for today's world, too.
So it was about stripping away maybe centuries of accumulated traditions or methods and going right back to the basics of how Jesus trained and sent people out.
Exactly that. It was about embracing the simplicity, the reproducibility, the reliance on local leaders, the focus on relationship and service that really characterized Jesus's initial commission.
Okay. And the results of embracing that seemingly simple, yet often sacrificial model.
Were, according to the source, surprising successes in places previously thought impossible to reach.
Like where?
Within totalitarian regimes, in strongholds of major world religions like Hinduism, among the very people groups who historically brought Islam to Africa, and yeah, even in regions the source vividly describes as having brazen shrines to Satan. Places were transformed, peoples were transformed in staggering numbers.
You mentioned earlier these methods address 21st century barriers. How do these simple, reproducible methods rooted in Jesus' model do that? Things like, secularism, hostility, lack of resources, mistrust of institutions.
Well, that's where the genius of this approach, as the source describes it, really lies. I mean, think about it. In a world where big institutions are often distrusted,
Right.
movements based on simple relationships and easily reproducible tools kind of bypass that whole structure. Where resources are scarce, the focus isn't on building expensive buildings, but on empowering ordinary people using whatever they do have.
Low cost, high accessibility.
Exactly. In hostile environments, quiet multiplication within homes and existing communities is much less visible and therefore less vulnerable than large public events or prominent church buildings.
Makes sense.
And the emphasis on service, like we saw in that African story, it can disarm hostility and create openings where maybe direct preaching would just be shut down immediately.
So it's precisely because the methods are simple, reproducible, and rely on local believers that they thrive in these challenging conditions.
That seems to be the argument, yes. Conditions that are common in the Global South, but which perhaps are becoming increasingly relevant in parts of the Global North, too.
That's an interesting connection. And the scale of this strategy's impact circles back to those big numbers we discussed.
It does. Remember, researchers are tracking over 650 of these movements globally. The source gives an example of just one network called New Generations.
Okay.
They're actively working among 480 previously unreached or unengaged people groups or urban communities. And out of those 480 initiatives, 110 are now classified as full-blown movements.
And a movement means?
Defined here as having at least 100 churches that have reproduced through at least 4 generations of disciples making disciples. So it's not just growth, it's sustained multi-generational multiplication.
Got it. And it's not just this one group seeing this.
No, the material confirms many other organizations are reporting similar remarkable results, and as the research gets shared, the picture becomes clearer. What's happening is described as dramatic, widespread, and accelerating.
Okay. So that's the thrilling side from the source's title, this unprecedented accelerating growth and transformation in the Global South, driven by these specific strategies rooted in Jesus' model. But, as the title also suggests, there's a disturbing side to this story, too.
Yes, and that's the stark contrast. While the Global South is experiencing this explosive growth, it's happening against the backdrop of significant decline in the traditional heartlands of Christianity, the Global North.
Europe, North America.
Right. Church attendance affiliation have dropped significantly in Europe. And while the numbers in the U.S. are somewhat maintained overall, the source suggests that's often due to immigration from the very regions in the Global South where Christianity is thriving.
So the shift isn't just a relative gain in the South. it's coupled with an absolute decline, or at least stagnation, masked by immigration in the North.
That's what the data presented in the source indicates, yes. And this situation really prompts the core questions that the rest of the material tries to tackle.
Which are?
Things like, what factors contributed to this decline in the church in the global North? Why did the church in the global South take off using these methods, while the church in the North generally hasn't? And crucially, what does the church in the global North need to learn from what's happening elsewhere?
The source seems to structure its remaining content around diagnosing those issues in the North and looking at potential lessons from the South end.
Right. It apparently delves into historical factors, shifts in worldview, institutional structures, things it argues have led the church in the North away from some of the core biblical principles and practices that seem to be powering these movements in the South.
Okay.
And then it explores how Jesus's approach, the one proving so effective globally, could potentially be, appropriated and applied in the global North context today.
The source also seems to anticipate some potential reactions someone reading or hearing this might have, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It offers a kind of word of caution. It acknowledges that this analysis might sound overly critical of the church in the global North.
Which could put some people on the defensive.
Exactly. But the author's counter-response, presented in the material, is basically that if we're going to honestly address the challenges, we have to be clear and direct about identifying the problems. They state their commitment is to the church, and their desire is to see the gospel flourish everywhere.
Okay, so it's critique aimed at restoration, not just complaint. What's the other potential reaction it mentions?
That these principles, multiplication, simple tools, reliance on prayer, service, might seem, well, kind of obvious or simple.
Like, yeah, we know that stuff.
Right. But the source pushes back on that, and I think it's a really crucial point. It challenges the reader, or you listening, to consider, is it evident in your practice or just in your beliefs?
Not just intellectual agreement, but actual implementation.
Precisely. If it seems self-evident, is it actually being lived out? The material uses this analogy of a recipe, saying this whole approach doesn't work without all the ingredients in place.
Okay.
So the purpose of this whole exploration, according to the source, is to look honestly at the challenges faced in places of decline and consider the principles animating these places of dramatic growth, not just as interesting facts, but as potential pathways forward.
So to kind of bring this deep dive toward a close,
Right.
we've really explored this incredibly dramatic contrast.
Yeah, it's stark.
On one hand, unprecedented, accelerating growth and transformation happening across the global South. Propelled by these specific, reproducible strategies rooted in Jesus' own methods, empowered by prayer and service, juxtaposed with significant decline or stagnation in the historically dominant regions of the global North.
And the central challenge, or maybe opportunity, highlighted by this massive global shift seems pretty clear.
Which is?
For those in the global North, what does this mean? What insights can actually be drawn? And what principles from the movements thriving elsewhere could potentially be learned from and applied in their own contexts?
And maybe a final thought to leave you, the listener, with drawing from the source. Consider that governor in Africa.
Yeah.
The one who concluded that Muslims needed to learn how to be better servants from Christians. Or that challenging question the source raises. Are these principles of multiplication, simple training, radical obedience, are they truly evident not just in our beliefs, but in our practice?
It's a searching question.
Because the sheer scale of the transformation described in these movements suggests they are far more than just interesting theories. What might it actually look like to truly apply these principles, not just understand them in your own community or context?
Yeah, something to really ponder. The implications of this definitive shift in global Christianity. What does this new reality mean for your understanding, and what lessons might it hold for action moving forward?